Welcome, sixth graders. This video is to explain what the design cycle is. And it's something that you're going to be using throughout the entire semester in GTT. It's how you're graded for every assignment. But ultimately, I want you to understand simply what is the design cycle and how we're going to be using it. So the second part is going to be note-taking. I'm going to copy it down some notes, and you're going to have the chance to copy it into your design notebook. And then I'm going to give you a sample of how I used the design cycle recently. And then lastly, you're going to have a chance to try and write down how you have used the design cycle. So going back to step number one of what is it? And the design cycle in GTT is going to be these 4 steps: inquiring and analyzing, developing ideas, creating the solution, and evaluating. And we're going to eventually break down what each of those 4 things mean individually, but just ultimately the design cycle, let's simplify it and break it down a little bit more to understand what it is. And so the design cycle of who, what, where, when, why. First, who uses it? All of us do. All of you have used the design cycle in your life. You may not realize it, and you may not have even used it in school, but the reason all of us have used it is because the design cycle is when we take steps to solve a problem. It's going through that process of making a decision or doing an activity, and all of us have done those things. Where have we used it? Everywhere, even outside of school. And you use it anytime you're going to make a decision, do an activity, or with GTT class, it's how you're going to document all of your work to make sure you're completing all the steps. And why do we do it? It's to help us solve the problems and to make sure we're going through each step. And for GTT, it's to document our work in there. So going back to this, the 4 steps is going to be something that we break down here in a moment, but before we do that, notice there are arrows going in every direction. And that's the reason is we're not going to, step number 1 doesn't have to be inquiring and analyzing. Step number 2 doesn't have to go here, then step 3, then step 4. We're going to jump around back and forth. So it's possible that at one point you're developing ideas, and then maybe you jump straight to evaluating. And then from there, maybe you go back to inquiring and analyzing. And that's why we call it a cycle, is we're going to hit all 4 steps, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in that order. So let's break it down a little bit more of what each of these 4 things are. So for that, you're going to do some note taking. Open up your design notebook, hit the video on pause if you need to, and get to the design notebook, and we're going to scroll down to where here it says design process or the design cycle for inquiring and analyzing. I'm going to write down a definition for each of the 4 steps, and then you should hit the video on pause just to be able to type it in. And once you're all caught up, hit resume, and you can go on to the next part that I'm explaining. So for inquiring and analyzing, the definition we're going to use is the step where we identify the problem and investigate. And the way we do inquiring and analyzing, the most common ways I would say we use it in GTT is when we are researching. We also are inquiring and analyzing anytime we're asking questions. So before we can do the activity, we have to know how many people can I work with, all those basic questions and background information. We need all of this before we can go on to the next steps, and it's an important part, one of the 4 parts of the design cycle. So again, hit the video on pause if you still need to get caught up with copying these notes down, and then go on to developing ideas. And for that, our definition is going to be creating a plan. And to help us create a plan, when we're creating a plan and making a decision, we do that by often brainstorming with others. We're going to collaborate just to get ideas from other people. We're also going to make drawings or blueprints. So before we make something, we have to know what our plan is. We have to know exactly how we're going to make it, and we often show that by a drawing or a blueprint. And then this is the step where we are simply making decisions. And we want to figure this stuff out before we go on to actually doing the activity. So next then is creating the solution. The definition to that is when we are following the plan. So whatever the plan is, this is the step where I now execute the plan and actually go through with it. And so in GTT class, you're gonna see this by building or making things. And it's also when you are testing things out, whatever your product is. And then the last part of the design cycle is when you are evaluating. And for evaluating, the definition we're going to use is when we are reflecting on all the steps. And so to reflect, it's asking ourselves questions of, is it successful? Why or why not? Could it be improved? By doing those questions, you may end up going back to your planning part, you may going back to research, but it's reflecting at the end because we're not done with it once we test it. We have to reflect on what we did. So that's going to be our definition and small sample of what the design cycle is. And now I want to give a sample of how I did it. All of the examples I used are just kind of vague, but when I had to buy a cell phone recently. My cell phone I had for 5 years, and it wasn't sending text messages all the time. I wasn't receiving them. So I knew it was time to get a phone. And before I just went out and simply bought one, I went through the design cycle. I went through each of these 4 steps. If I just simply went out and bought the phone, that would have been creating the solution if I didn't have a plan prior. So I'm going to give you an example of how I went through the design cycle when I needed a new cell phone. You're going to have a little bit different scenario, but my scenario is going to be when I needed a new cell phone, how did I inquire and analyze? Well, did I research, ask questions, or background information? Absolutely. And so when I researched, I might have went to a website like this where it's breaking down different cell phones and which one's going to be the best. So instead of simply typing in my design notebook research, I'm going to actually take the link that gave me research and I'm going to paste it in here for the teacher to see. So that's step number 1, but I also had to ask myself questions and think about what my plan is going to be, such as how much am I willing to spend? And so if I know I have $1,000 to spend on a cell phone versus only $200, that's going to make a big difference in my planning part and what my decision is going to be. I also then had to look up prices, and that's part of research. And looking at my notes here, I have to ask, do I want another iPhone or switch to Android? By answering these questions to myself, that's helping me form a plan, but I have to ask these questions. That's part of the design cycle. And so when I get to developing ideas where it's creating a plan, when I needed a new cell phone, the way I did that was, well, I see on Amazon that the price is going to be lower than if I were to just buy it straight from Apple. I can also then brainstorm with others, and so I asked my wife for input and cost options. That's going to help me know then what can I buy, what makes sense for me, and ultimately help me make my decision. And so the last part then is a blueprint or drawing. I didn't actually draw out what phone I wanted, but for the sake of this class, if you're having to do that, I'm going to take the picture that I'm using, or that of the phone that I got, and I'm going to put it in here for proof of my blueprint or drawing. So now I have proof of how I use the design cycle of developing ideas when I needed to buy a new cell phone. So far I've got 3 options here, and you'll notice the first one is in blue. That's because it is a must do. The next 2 that I just completed are in orange font, which is I should do that. That's where I'm getting up to that grade of 5 or 6. And even though it's not easy to continue adding more options, the pink bullet points, which is 2 more, is the aspire to do. So I encourage you to aspire to get 5 options for each of these. That's how you can get that grade of 7 or an 8. Moving on to the next one, creating the solution. What does that look like when I had to buy a cell phone? Well, testing it, building it, and making it or completing the plan is, my plan was to buy it on Amazon. And so I bought the iPhone XS on Amazon. I followed the plan. From there then, I tested out the phone. So instead of just saying testing phone, I have to be detailed, and I'm going to say I texted Mr. Severson to make sure the phone works. From there then, I navigated the different features on the phone. Whether it's browsing the internet, looking at the games, I'm testing it out and trying out the phone. So that's how I created the solution. And from there then, it's evaluating. And I have to ask myself, was the phone successful? Could it be improved? And for my situation of buying a cell phone, I like the phone because it sends text messages without problems. And that's the whole reason why I wanted a new cell phone, is because I was having troubles with my previous one. Going further, then I could ask myself, how could it be improved? Is I think it could be improved by adding a home button at the bottom. It doesn't have that. Doesn't mean I don't like it, but that's a way it could be improved. And lastly, I think it was a good purchase for the amount I spent on it. Okay, and so that's how I evaluated and went through the entire design cycle when I needed to buy a new cell phone. So now you are going to work on a sample, and your sample is going to be a little bit different than mine. But every one of us in the morning when we get dressed, we go through the design cycle. Do you write it down? Of course not. But you still go through these 4 steps. And I want you to take time right now to go to your design notebook. And if you start with inquiring and analyzing, when you're getting dressed, what kind of questions do you ask yourself to form a plan? How do you know what you're going to wear? What are your options? And so if you write down then as many examples of when you're getting dressed, how do you do inquiring and analyzing? Then go down below to when you're developing ideas. Well, our developing ideas is when we're creating a plan. And so that means you're making a decision, you're drawing or having a blueprint, and brainstorming with others. So if you're getting dressed, what does that mean? How are you doing that? You have to do that for all 4 steps of the design cycle, and try to get down as many as you can, and try to be specific rather than just simply saying, I tested it or I wore it. If you have questions, feel free to ask your teacher, and we'll be happy to walk you through it together.